Thank you everyone for joining our event today. The devastating cycle of impunity in Ethiopia, causes, consequences, and solutions. My name is Vanessa Tsahaya. I'm the Horn of Africa campaigner at Amnesty International. And this event is co-organized with Amnesty International and the Human Rights Program at Harvard Law School. So I want to start off by thanking the program for a great partnership so far. We thought it would be crucial to have this conversation now for several reasons. Ethiopia is currently at a crossroads. Despite continued security issues and abuses since the cessation of hostilities agreement in November last year, it is largely seen as a post-conflict country that states and institutions are renegotiating their approach and relationship with. The mandate of the sole remaining international justice mechanism on Ethiopia is currently being debated at the United Nations Human Rights Council, and many states who have previously supported or been vocal supporters of justice and accountability in Ethiopia are now slowly withdrawing their support. So we wanted to have this discussion about what would be at stake for Ethiopia if justice once again is sidelined. We will look back historically, we will look at the current time, and we will look ahead as we unpack the wide-ranging consequences of impunity, of course globally, but with a specific focus on Ethiopia. We will also assess what's possible moving forward as individuals, organizations, institutions, states, etc. So thank you again for joining. I will be introducing our panel shortly, but I just want to present the format of the event first. Each panelist will be providing a short assessment of the situation, about the theme, according to their own experiences and research and priorities. And after that, we will be doing question and answers from me, and then we will open up Q&A from the audience. So if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A chat. And if there's anything else afterwards, feel free to tweet and we'll see if we can continue the conversation online. So start off by introducing our panel. We have Fisaha Tekle, who is an international human rights law advisor at Amnesty International between 2015 and 2022. So for a long time, he was the Ethiopia researcher at Amnesty International, where he documented and produced several reports about grave human rights violations in the country. And as the period indicates, it was both before, during, and shortly after the conflict in Tigray and the wider region in northern Ethiopia. He's also conducted and led advocacy efforts and research on justice, transitional justice, accountability in Ethiopia and beyond. We also have Dr. Abadir Ibrahim, who is the Associate Director of the Human Rights Program at the Harvard Law School. Before joining HRP, he was the head of the Secretariat for the Legal and Justice Affairs Advisory Council of Ethiopia, an institution established as an independent body to advise the government on conducting pro-democracy and pro-rights justice sector reforms. In the past year, he has been a vocal voice and has written extensively on the need to prioritize justice, critiques of ongoing initiatives, and providing advice on what he thinks the future should look like for justice in Ethiopia. We also have Rita Kasai, who's an author and activist. After the conflict in Tigray started, she was actively campaigning for the protection of civilians, the end of the humanitarian blockade, and justice for survivors and victims, in particular, focus on sexual violence survivors. She's one of the authors of the book Plain Sight, which documents sexual violence abuses in the conflict in Tigray. She was a strong campaigner for the establishment of international justice mechanisms such as ICRI, and has now continued that campaigning for its renewal currently here now in September, in October. So that is the introductions for all our great panelists. Thank you very much for joining us today. We'll start off with each panelist's 5-minute presentation, and then I'll start with questions. So Fisaha, maybe you can start, Dr. Abadir, and then Rita can end. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa, and also thanks Amnesty and the Harvard Human Rights Center for organizing this quite relevant and timely panel about the culture of impunity and the prospects for accountability in Ethiopia at the time when the only justice mechanism or the only investigative mechanism about atrocities in the context of the conflict in northern Ethiopia is at risk. So as you have rightly mentioned, I was a researcher covering Ethiopia for 7 years before moving to my new role. And during that time, my desktop was full of blood, actually. And it was, we are not jumping from one atrocity to another atrocity, but atrocities were happening at the same time in different parts of the country. And so we were forced to kind of do a prioritization between atrocities. And so, like, we cannot say that we have documented that during that time. Actually, I came to be a researcher in 2015, just a few months before the start of the protest in Oromia that spread to Amhara region. And that protest, which was largely peaceful, had left about 5,000 people, with the least estimate dead, most of them youth. At the same time, there were also other violations happening, mass violations happening in the country, in the southern part of the country. For instance, in Konso, there was a mass killing, but it remained underreported because it had to compete with other atrocities. The same thing in Somali region, where hundreds of thousands of Oromos were displaced. And in some instances, in a pogrom-like situation, it's exactly like 6 years from now, it was in September, that thousands of Oromos living in major towns in Somali region were evicted from Somali region by the EU policy and also by the local population, especially the youth. And we also had torture in prisons, the famous Mahakalai prison, you might remember it. In Sidama and Walaita, we had a lot of mass killings in 2018 and 19. Also in Somali region after 2018, there was an attack on the Orthodox Christians in Jitiga and other major towns. The same thing that happened in Oromia, especially targeting the Amhara and non-Oromo residents, that happened after the killing of the famous artist Hachalu Hundessa, left hundreds of people dead. And also the government forces, regional and federal force, killing and arresting residents in Borana, Gujiwaleka, and the rest of Oromia since 2018 as part of the law enforcement operation against the Oromo Liberation Army in Oromia. In Benishangul, against the Oromos, against the local population, and also the Amharas. So we are not short of atrocities in Ethiopia. And these are just the microcosm, like what I'm mentioning, just a microcosm of what was happening. And I cannot say that this is a full list. And also exactly 5 years or 6 years before, I remember just next to, in the outskirts of Addis, a lot of Gamo ethnic group members were killed. And also, yeah, so there are so many of them. And I'm just mentioning those that happened between 2017 and 2015 and 2022. And this is like without mentioning what happened in the post-election period in 2005, or without mentioning what happened in Somali region as part of the counterinsurgency movement, where the regional EU police, special police, and the federal military killed thousands, raped a lot of women and girls. But what is common among this history of atrocity in Ethiopia is that the lack of justice and accountability. What is frustrating in this line of job, being a researcher on Ethiopia, is that you document, but you rarely see any kind of redress for the victims, whether you call it compensation, whether you call it criminal accountability, truce or any kind of reinstatement, that is rare. And it was in this context that the conflict in northern Ethiopia that started in Tigray has come. And given this culture of impunity, you can see, even at the beginning, you can expect what kind of violations would happen. So impunity is a common denominator. Large-scale human rights violations have been happening for a very long time, not only during my time or my tenure as a researcher, even before that. But there is no accountability for that or no redress for the victims. So this is what I can start with for the time being. That I will go to the details and also the prospect and what is the root cause later after the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Fasaha. Over to you, Dr. Abadi.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. And I'd like to thank Vanessa and Amnesty International for initiating and putting together this panel. And thank you, Fasaha, for presenting what was such a difficult period in Ethiopian history. And I can only empathize with your position of having to document these atrocities and suffering secondary trauma for years, non-ending, and without seeing any prospects of hope or glimmers of hope now and then, or at least once, but generally in this pessimistic context. What I'd like to do in my 5 minutes, and Vanessa, please stop me if I go over my 5 minutes, is two things. I would like to contextualize this conversation from 2 points of view. From a broader picture, I would like to say that we started with a race to the bottom. And definitely since 2015, we started to a race to the bottom, and the current prospects are also things that I'd like to contextualize. When I say we started a race to the bottom in 2015, is there are a couple of economic and political dynamics that were taking shape in 2015. And definitely following the 2018 transition, which came after a palace coup, basically, within the regime itself, there were political trends that were relevant to human rights. Let me try to connect those two things. First of all, starting 2015, but definitely starting in 2018, the human rights condition of Ethiopia was in constant deterioration, and this was taking place in a context in which there was a lack of, there was a lack of, I could say but at least any serious initiatives to establish a mutually tolerable and a stable political system. And that failure was feeding into the human rights context. So it was, the human rights conditions were deteriorating, the levels of violence were going up. There was a failure to achieve a real political transition. And these things were feeding into each other, basically, and a vicious circle that is, going on a downward spiral is what was taking place. In the political sphere, and this is true after 2018, but certainly more so since the 2020 war started, or the 2020 elections were postponed and the 2020 November 2020 war was started. There is a trend in which it was clear that political relationships were shaping into a zero-sum game where, there could only be clear winners and losers. There wasn't a compromise. There wasn't any half measures that were acceptable in the political sphere. Everyone stood for complete victory, and everyone else who opposed them stood for complete victory as well. And who's a winner and loser was usually, in the broadest terms, was either framed on political and ideological terms, but in reality, it was more drawn on tactical and on identity lines and based on tactical alliance between different identity and political groups. And when the November 2020 war started, there was a clear trend of, an Ethiopianist camp with the government, of course, surprisingly with Eritrea, and then the federalist camp. And that was the context in which the war was taking place. That was the context in which the gross human rights violations were taking place. But currently, even that much clarity has deteriorated, and there's loose alliances between different identity groups that don't necessarily work together, but work against a common enemy is what we have today. So in terms of politics, we have extreme and even more increasingly extreme polarization, an all or nothing struggle that is shaping up to be an all or nothing struggle between extreme good and extreme evil, where it becomes more and more acceptable to, when it's framed in terms of good and evil, it becomes acceptable to extinguish evil at whatever costs. And in the human rights context, what that meant is that each side in this political sphere, and unfortunately, many, I will say, in the human rights community, started approaching human rights in a purely instrumentalist terms, where the levels of solidarity between different groups are extremely low. And human rights are seen as, from an instrumentalist point of view, where human rights violations are already accepted. Human rights violations are seen as an acceptable form of doing politics. Gross human rights violations are seen as an acceptable form of doing politics, which means that when it comes to human rights reporting, the different groups would identify with their own groups, and they would conceal, tolerate, and sometimes, many times, even welcome human rights violations, except for when those violations are against what they see as their own end group, they would expose and denounce human rights violations. And without solidarity between these different groups, human rights is increasingly seen as in a polarized way that is really defined by whataboutisms and polarization, and in a context where any human rights reporting is almost decreasingly seen as something that Ethiopians frown upon together. Now, in this context, this has been the context that's prevailing. The next point is that things are most likely, given what is going on today, given the expansion of the conflict into another region, things will either get worse before they get better, or they'll just keep getting worse. And the reason I say this is because Ethiopia, since 2015, before 2015, Ethiopia was unstable from a political point of view, but stable from a security point of view. And it's become less and less and less stable on both political and security terms. In the current situation, one could say that Ethiopia went from being a fragile state to almost turning into a failing or even a failed state, where the government does not control a vast, an increasing portion of its own territory, and where there are different actors fighting different wars, and even international actors in Ethiopia. And I say that things will get worse before they get better, or they might even get worse and worse, is because groups in Ethiopia that represent large segments of the population have major grievances, real or perceived grievances, that are mutually exclusive, and every group's grievances are exacerbated by the deteriorating human rights condition, and these human rights violations are taking place by the government, by its opponents, and sometimes amongst or between its opponents, or sometimes even within groups inside the government. Given this war, and given other contexts, especially, if we assume today that all belligerents and all political parties in Ethiopia would sit together and agree to have peace, or at least agree to stop fighting, the situation is still going to be intractable. It's still going to be extremely difficult to come out of, because given the war and given the almost complete collapse of the institutions of the rule of law and governance and justice, it is going to be extremely difficult for Ethiopia to attract business and capital and investments, and especially the foreign direct investment type of investments, which means that which means, given Ethiopia's high population rates, given high youth unemployment, and given the increasing food insecurity, which is getting worse really rapidly, if you don't have a quick infusion of investment in Ethiopia, the ability of political parties, the government, or even allied with its current detractors, is unlikely to come up with a situation that overcomes this high population density, high youth population density, which makes it easy to raise armies. So Ethiopia will struggle and remain fragile for years to come. And I hope the worst case scenario does not persist, but Ethiopia is on track towards state failure and state collapse. And with that, let me stop. I know I haven't gone into in depth into human rights, but let me use this prompt and then maybe circle back to things. Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you. And that was a very good introduction to issues that will definitely come back in the discussion. So over to Rita now. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. I hope you can all hear me. Right? Can you hear me?
I don't know if the...
Excellent. Okay, so I'd like to first start by thanking my fellow panelists and Vanessa for organizing such an important conversation. I think it's important to start speaking about my stay in Sudan. So I was in the refugee camps in Sudan for a year, where I was speaking to victims of international crimes. And from that experience, I have to stress how I'm extremely concerned about how little we understand about the magnitude of the atrocities that took place in Western Tigray in particular, because the refugees in Sudan were predominantly from Western Tigray and from areas that the people from the Kamant ethnic group reside. And with the lack of access that the Independent Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia have had to Sudan, to Ethiopia, and to Djibouti, where almost all the victims are, they will only mean that the excruciating report that came out just this last week was not able to truly grasp the reality on the ground. So that's my first concern about ICRI and the victims of international crimes. But despite the scarcity of information, the people, I think on the ground, the victims throughout Ethiopia were determined to make their truths heard, and ICRI, the Independent Commission of Human Rights Experts, did an excellent job at capturing what they could virtually. I think initially with the connection issues in Tigray, with the imposed blockade by the government of Ethiopia, people were not able to connect to any kind of investigative mechanism for a very long time. It was well after the Pretoria, like 2 months after the Pretoria Agreement, that people could connect with them. And I have to say that still now, from my visits to Tigray this last month, connection issues are a massive problem. The majority of the conflicts related to sexual violence that had taken place happened in rural areas. So people have to travel for a really long time on foot, or have trouble with public transport generally to come into the cities where they'd have connection to connect with these, with the investigators. To give you one example, at Irobanina, we collected some data in one village near a town called Asimba. It's Awia in Irob. At least 20 girls have been raped by Eritrean forces who burned down the village's houses as well. We also have a story from one lady from the Irob region who was held in sexual slavery in the Irob region for 2 months. And then once the Eritrean troops became occupied with war against the TDF, they forgot about these conflict-related sexual violence victims, and the victims managed to flee. This victim ended up in going to Addis to her brother, where she was seeking, help. She was trying to escape the war, and her brother was arrested because he was a Tigrayan, because of his ethnicity, by Ethiopian Federal Police. When that happened, she realized that she was also at risk, so she fled. She went down to the border in Moyale, around Kenya, where she was trying to cross into Kenya, and she was again raped by Ethiopian Federal Police and eventually crossed into Kenya, and became pregnant as a result of the rapes, and was coerced into having a child as a result of rape, because she couldn't receive any of the proper post-rape assistance. So the other issue following this story that I want to highlight is that Eritrean troop crimes have not been included in this, they can't be included in this transitional justice policy framework that the Ethiopian government has prepared. So then that leaves us with what the Ethiopian government have been kind of pushing here in Geneva, with arguments against the ICRI, so in the Independent Commission of Human Rights Experts. So they've been speaking about how their transitional justice mechanism is perfect and has been a result of consultations with victim groups. The policy itself, I think, generally doubly victimizes the victims of the international crimes. Our colleagues, the previous speaker was speaking about how Ethiopia is extremely fragmented and polarized, and I think it is. But the Independent Commission of Human Rights Experts in Ethiopia had mentioned yesterday that they spoke to victims from across all of Ethiopia, and the victims that they had spoken to were all in agreement that this transition policy framework is not something that they would trust or that they would give their testimonies to. I'll finish for now by speaking about the hundreds of victims that I myself have interviewed. They are asked, at the end of my interviews with them, I always ask what would you like to see now? What does justice mean to you, and what is it that you want to see going forward? And some of them do say they just want to return home. These are the interviews from Sudan. Some say they just want peace. Some want to see their perpetrators held to account, but when asked, do they trust the Ethiopian government or the current domestic system to remedy the crimes that they've endured, 100% of them have said no. And I think that is in alignment with what ICRI have also found. So I'll stop there, Vanessa, and then we can do the Q&A later.
Thank you very much, Rita, for your testimony and for sharing the experiences of working on the ground, both in Sudan and in Tigray. I thank you to all the panelists for your introductory remarks. The purpose of this panel is to look at justice as a concept in Ethiopia and to really contextualize why justice matters now, and to look back to understand, the real consequences of the lack of justice and the pervading of impunity. And so I wanted to start the questions by looking back and then kind of slowly getting into the present and then looking ahead towards the end. So although a lot of the comments so far have already touched on many of the topics, we'll kind of move around them and slowly make our way to the end. So the first question I wanted to ask, and any panelists feel free to answer or not answer any question. I'll ask a question, you can go ahead, and if no one, if you don't want to answer, I'll move on to the next question. And just want to say, Rita, we can't see you. I didn't want to interrupt you when you were presenting, but your camera's not on. I don't know if that's intentional, but okay, perfect. Now we can see you. So just so we can continue seeing you for the rest of the event. So my first question is, if we look back at impunity in Ethiopia historically, this panel description had a sentence that said, there's never been any meaningful justice in Ethiopia for grave human rights violations. What does that mean? Can you give examples of where there has been inaction or insufficient action? I guess it's easier to give examples of inaction, all the atrocities that Taha already mentioned in his introduction. But are there any examples of where there has been insufficient action, where people have felt or spoken about justice in Ethiopia, but we can, confidently say that those efforts were never meaningful or successful? So if any panelists want to discuss that, and then we'll go on to the next question. Thank you.
May I come in, Vanessa?
Of course.
Okay, thank you. As I have said earlier, it's not only that, it's not that there was no meaningful justice. There was no justice. We can definitely say that. There were, atrocities are plenty in Ethiopia. Actually, what was happening is that the forum of atrocities were shifting from one place to another, sometimes happening simultaneously in different places. So the last 30 years, even more, they were full of atrocities. But if you look at any attempts at justice or any investigation mechanism or accountability, they barely qualify as justice initiatives. The one I remember was that the post-election inquiry commission, which was kind of established by the parliament. When the findings of that commission was found to be unfavorable, we know what happened. Some of the members were forced to leave the country, and those who chose to remain were forced to revise their findings. And even you remember what happened in 2007 in Gambella. There was mass atrocity in a violence between the Anuak and the Nuer communities there, and there was a commission established to investigate that, and it didn't come up with any meaningful finding, and it was not even credible. Some of the people were arrested, but it was a more of politically motivated arrest. and finally some of them were released after the 2018 transition. So those are the ones which I remember. There was a trial of the Derg officials, but it was full of irregularities, and it was short of full justice, while it was focusing on the accountability part. There was no proper what we call justice and redress recognition for the victims. And also, to some extent, we can call it victor's justice, because those who have committed similar violations while the Derg officials have killed the youth were not brought to justice. And we know that some violations that happened in the context of the war with the Derg were not even discussed. Even after 2018, there was some initiative to go after some of the perpetrators of torture in Makalawi prison and also in Somali region. But if you look at the charges and the trials, they were not really accounting for the full extent of human rights violations those people were suspected of. So, for instance, if you look at those people who were charged for the Somali violence, Somali region violence, I mean, they were charged of few instances, while they were suspected of all those things which I have mentioned earlier, denial of humanitarian aid in Somali region during the counter-insurgency against the ONLF fighters in Somali region. Hundreds, if not thousands, were tortured, and they didn't get any kind of redress or justice for those violations. So one thing which I would like to stress in this situation is that those in political positions have the incentive of not ensuring accountability, actually ensuring impunity, because one, violence is an unaccepted way of doing politics in Ethiopia. And I'm just kind of emphasizing what Dr. Abadr has said, that violence has the modus operandi of political leaders in Ethiopia, and there is violence has become a political capital. It's not only the government, also other factions within the country. They are using it as a political capital. That's the way they are organizing themselves. They are going to their constituencies. They are mobilizing their constituencies. And this is supported by the culture of impunity. So people are not afraid of any kind of accountability. So they can join any kind of gang they are able to join, and kind of revenge against any group they perceive it to be their enemy historically, currently. So as Rita has also mentioned, I mean, in this context, transitional justice is an ideal initiative. I mean, given the gravity and the scale of atrocities in Ethiopia, the regular way of doing justice will not be enough. So that's when we require transitional justice. But the problem, as Rita has said, is that this transitional justice initiative is fully owned by a government which is equally responsible for, I mean, mainly responsible for the violations, especially in the last 3-4 years. So there is no way of having a trust of the victims. If the perpetrator is a judge, you cannot trust that process. So there is no trust in this process. I will come to the solution later, but the transitional justice initiative is being led by institutions and individuals who have been enablers of the violations in the last 2 or 3 years. So there is no way we are going to have proper transitional justice. So what will be the solution? I will come to it later if I have the chance. But this is the main concern we need to further explore.
Vanessa, can I add one more thing to what Fasaha just said?
Absolutely. The floor is all yours.
So, someone in the chat was also asking if justice or investigations are possible currently. And I'll say that they are possible, but they're improbable. And I'll circle back to possible but improbable. But let me quickly say, I think Fasaha mentioned the Red Terror trials, the Gambella investigation, or Gambella Commission, I think it was called, the 2005 Election Commission. There was one more in the Oromian Regional Parliament. There was an investigatory committee or commission established to investigate violations of human rights inside Oromia. And I'll say, other than the Red Terror had components of a genuine attempt to achieve justice, but failures due to, victors' justice components and components of human rights violations of the alleged perpetrators. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights actually decided that the Red Terror trial defendants, their presumption of innocence was violated, which basically takes this years-long investigation and prosecution came to nothing because their presumption of innocence was violated. But there's a change in Ethiopian transitional justice initiatives around 2008 when the Ogaden violations were war crimes and crimes against humanity in Ogaden were taking place. The Ethiopian government actually shifted its approach to transitional justice. And even the Red Terror trial individuals who are convicted were released from prison, they were pardoned. There is this sense of seeing war crimes as, war crimes are things that the government is committing now. Therefore, there is a shift that we're not prosecuting war crimes. We're just, forgiving each other. And that trend has persisted through the Gambella 2005 Commission, the Oromia Parliament Commission, all of which there's the new trend in those commissions was that the Ethiopian government not only used them to avoid justice, which Cronin-Furman describes as quasi-compliance, but they did worse. They actually used those transitional justice mechanisms to persecute the victims and victim groups. Like the Gambella investigations ended up in prosecuting Gambella opposition forces and protesters. The 2005 election one had similar components. The Oromia one actually found that it wasn't the fault of the government, but the protesters, blaming some elements within the country. People usually, and within the Ethiopian human rights community, like to draw a line that doesn't exist between 2018, pre and post 2018, and say, oh, that's in the past. But it's not in the past. It is the same government. It is the same people. It's the same military. And not only that, we have a precedent with the Reconciliation Commission of Ethiopia that was established in 2018, which basically ended up being shut down without achieving justice. It was mostly a public relations stint that helped the government helped the government take attention away from the injustices that Fasaha was describing. For example, the Somali regional state or the prosecution of Abdi Ile, he was being prosecuted for basically opposing the government and not for the war crimes and crimes against humanity that he committed. So the Reconciliation Commission was a failure because the government did not want justice, because the government did not want transitional justice. And I was partially involved with attempts to revive the Reconciliation Commission and turn it into a real transitional justice mechanism. And what happened was that those attempts were shut down by the government, were rejected or actively shut down by the government. despite the fact that at least the current leaders of the government did not risk prosecution or exposure if the Ethiopian Reconciliation Commission did its work. They just didn't want justice. Now you have a situation where the Ethiopian government is accused of committing war crimes and crimes against humanity, in which, you know, soldiers and civilians, 600,000 Ethiopians were dead in just one region, in just one area of Ethiopia. And as Fasah said, it's the people who are allegedly, at least, responsible for these war crimes and crimes against humanity that are being asked to do transitional justice against themselves. So that is, you know, is it possible to do that? Theoretically, yes, but it's extremely, extremely improbable that a local initiative, as long as, you know, the government can have its way, it's not going to let transitional justice happen in Ethiopia. Thank you.
Thank you. Rita, feel free if you want to answer, or I'll go on to the next question, and you're very welcome to come back to the question if you want as well.
Not to answer, just to add on what both of them have said, I think it's important to highlight that, yeah, you, like you said, that there's been impunity throughout the history of Ethiopia, but important to highlight how impunity is currently being enabled by members of the international community, or like these institutions that exist to promote and protect human rights. They're made up of individual states with individual interests that seem to have no real interest in human rights. It's clear in Ethiopia right now that there's ongoing violent conflict in Amhara, where federal troops are recorded to have been going house to house, killing civilians. There's ongoing violations in Tigray. Irob is 60% occupied, again, by Eritrean troops. Western Tigray is still blocked. There has been no humanitarian access to Irob. There are still refugees in Sudan suffering another conflict. And we have the EU and other member states who are debating about the extension of ICRI, knowing full well that that is what should happen. So this is adding to impunity and contributing to the ongoing violence in Ethiopia. That's all. Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you. And it's, I mean, it's an excellent point, and it's definitely, you know, the context of this conversation is definitely around what is happening and what has been this shift. You know, some of the mandate holders who used to push for justice and now are suddenly saying justice is not as important. So we'll definitely get back to that. So thank you for bringing that up. I wanted to continue speaking about the culture of impunity in Ethiopia and what the consequence of that has been. I really like the examples of the kind of fake justice mechanisms. That's not the right word, but or as Abdi mentioned before, the quasi-compliance approach, where you have looking like justice looking like mechanisms, but in fact has not provided real justice. What has been the consequences of those? And I wanted to look at that on 3 different levels: on individual levels, for individuals, for families, in terms of ethnic groups and communities in Ethiopia, what has been the impact there, and finally on national security. So I'll give a few examples of kind of what, you know, I'm kind of looking for, and then whoever wants to answer in whatever category, all categories, feel free to get into that. So first, on the level of individuals, and I really liked Rita's presentation that covered, and I know Fissa has done a lot of this work as well, really speaking to survivors and victims about what they want, what is justice, and what is the lack of whatever that justice is mean to them on a personal level. I'm a niece of a political prisoner, for example, in Eritrea. I have seen firsthand what the lack of justice means for people who've lost someone who, you know, he's been in prison for 22 years. The impact of justice on individuals and families are equally important to the overall, you know, what does justice mean for a country, for a state? So on that level, what does justice mean for individuals? What has the lack of justice meant for Ethiopians for the past, you know, how many decades at this point, not just in this war, but before? And also, how does that impact, you know, the lived experience of Ethiopians? Number 2 is around the communities. So one thing we spoke about, and I've seen comments about it as well in the chat, and this is something that's constantly talked about, is how extremely polarized Ethiopia is as a state, specifically around ethnic lines. many refer to different contributing factors to this, but is it possible that impunity could also be one of those? And how has that been instrumentalized by people in power or even leaders of different groups? And if you, as an example around impunity, the war in Tigray was very much framed as a justice effort to provide justice for what has happened in those 30 years prior to that. If you look at similarly in Eritrea, this is obviously a different state, but it's the same context because it's the same people and similar systems. The invasion and kind of involvement in Tigray has also been framed as a justice kind of effort. So how much has impunity contributed and continued to cause divisions in Ethiopia is the other question. And then I'll get into the third one because I realized that was a bit too much maybe for everyone to take in. So if there's anything you guys want to say about the impact of impunity on individuals and on ethnic groups in Ethiopia, please feel free.
I can quickly start us off by throwing in some points. So the lack of justice or impunity is going to create, I'll focus on the political, but let me start with the personal, in that, you know, violence is not something, you know, that you can easily forget. It is something that will stay with you, even in the best of circumstances. You know, as post-traumatic stress disorder, or you know, that traumatic experience is something that will define everything in your life after that point. And with the extreme levels of human rights violations that are taking place in Ethiopia, when you have a large segment of the population that, you know, has a lived experience of violence, it is very easy for that to feed into a cycle of violence. And I remember, I think in the last ICRI conversation at the UN, the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission presented, you know, saying something to the effect of, we have talked to people in the north and they don't want anything, but they want peace, they want the war to end, and they want maybe, you know, jobs, and that's all they've asked. I mean, you can imagine having experience about Ethiopia and knowing the discourse, you know, that's not true, but having an understanding of how the lived experience of violence creates the cycle of you know, vengeance and cycles of violence. I wouldn't be surprised if people didn't even want justice, but wanted revenge. And so even if people don't get an opportunity for revenge, and if there is peace that is based on this, you know, assumption, let's let things go and we are not going to have violence, even in the best of circumstances, this will create a fractured situation where you have victims who may for now decide to say they forgive, but maybe in the future will be reminded of their, you know, victimhood, and maybe support future polarized political context. So in Ethiopia, we need justice in order to deal with the extreme levels of violence that we are experiencing. And this is something, you know, and this is something that will help polarization, because every political group in Ethiopia will have, you can call it a left-leaning wing, which is going to stalk these grievances, these human rights violations, and say, look, you've been victimized and you need to do X, Y, Z. You need to be more extreme. You need to take revenge. So justice, without justice, the likelihood of that increases, and we will continue to have a fractious political context in Ethiopia. Let me hand it back to you.
Thank you very much. Fisaha, Rita, anything you want to add?
Just to add just minor points. I had a chance to talk to a lot of victims including those who have lost their family members, or who themselves have been directly victims, like rape survivors. It's not only that, even our last reports have kind of asked victims on what kind of justice they envisage and what they seek. And our finding is in quite extra opposite direction from what some of the government officials are presenting, because what we have seen is that the victims need justice, and it's also the same in the ICRI latest report, where they spoke to a lot of victims, and they say that they need justice and accountability, and they say never again. So for that to happen, or not to happen, justice and accountability is needed. So I don't know where some of the government officials or pro-government institutions are bringing this narrative that people just want reconciliation. Actually, reconciliation is not something that can happen overnight. Reconciliation only happens from justice. If people have justice, if people have accountability, if they have remedy, they will be able to reconcile. Without justice, they cannot live with their neighbor or with a security official, with a military who has killed or raped them. So that's unnatural. We are asking for something unnatural to do that, and it never happened. It might, there is a tendency to gloss over the real needs of, and I mean, we have a chance to peep into these consultations happening in different parts of Ethiopia. And from what we have heard, there was a lack of trust about the process, but also there is an overwhelming demand for justice. But that's not how it is being reported publicly by those who are handling the report. So, so that's one thing which I would like to stress. But so when there is impunity, the thing is that people tend to take the law into their hands. I mean, it is the exclusive in usual situations, in normal circumstances. Justice is the prerogative and the obligation of the state. When the state fails to deliver that, people tend to take it to their hands. And that's what's happening in different parts of the country. People have grievance, but they have not seen justice. So whenever the opportunity comes, they mobilize themselves, they form different groups, they call themselves in different names, and they want to settle their scores. Sorry for the background noise. The people tend to take their hand, and that's why the country is spiraling into this cycle of violence. And politically, it also has another dimension. The political group stokes on and capitalizes on this violence and impunity to prolong its stay in power. And they are also equally responsible for most of the violence. So they have the incentive to stay in power and to support this culture of impunity.
Vanessa, can I once again jump in for one or two sentences to complement and supplement what Fasaha said? So even when you do achieve justice, you're not guaranteed that people are going to be satisfied, that people aren't going to want more, want revenge. You know, there will be sectors of society that will not be satisfied even with justice. But if you don't have justice, you're almost guaranteeing that, you know, that you do not have the capacity to go with that victim group. And there are so many victim groups in Ethiopia. You aren't able to onboard that. You'll have a difficult time onboarding that victim group into a mutual common future. So you need justice, you need counseling, you need a transformation of the economy. There are so many things you should be able to achieve at the same time. Having said that, let me add one level of difficulties, one level of complexity that we'll be facing in Ethiopia, and that is, let's also not forget that when we're talking about justice, the authors of the injustice are people in power. They continue to be in power. So there might be a need to have an approach that is not drawing a clear line of justice and injustice, and try and figure out ways of onboarding perpetrator groups into the future of Ethiopia as well. Because if you tell perpetrators that they will be the losers in a future in which there's going to be justice, what you have is that they will resist any prospects of justice. They will resist any prospects of having a transition into that sphere in which the justice is possible. So that's going to be very tricky. But that doesn't mean, and this is a point of advice for our colleagues inside Ethiopia, our colleagues, transitional justice colleagues inside Ethiopia, is that, it doesn't therefore mean impunity. Because people who are accused of injustice are in power doesn't necessarily have to translate into impunity. It can be something else. And that something else is not going to be achieved by actors inside Ethiopia by insisting on impunity, or by basically consenting to impunity. And in that respect, I will say to my colleagues in Ethiopia that they will be facing an intractable situation. They will be overpowered by the authors of impunity and the authors of victimization. And they do, unlike what is going on today, they do need to build alliances with international allies in order to ensure justice in the short and long term. And that is something that is really lacking today, and needs addressing.
Thank you. Rita, anything you want to add?
Yeah, thank you, Vanessa. As you both mentioned, victims definitely do want justice in different forms, but justice nonetheless. So for some of them, they may say they're okay with peace for now, but will harbor resentment, and it will come out in some way, shape, or form down the line. But first, just thinking about the situation in Sudan, there's literally zero connection in these refugee camps. They get 7 kilograms of sorghum and like half a liter of oil per month, per person per month. They rarely have medical assistance because of the ongoing conflict in Khartoum. It is very, very difficult for individuals in these camps to be able to think about justice and accountability when they're struggling to survive. This is the case for people in IDPs and in desperate situations across all of Ethiopia. Second is that the government here, through a side panel where they were presenting about this transitional justice mechanism and the policy that they put together, and how they were consulting victim groups and different CSOs and whatnot across the country, how they're being inclusive and whatnot. One thing that they repeatedly spoke about was amnesty for perpetrators of these crimes, because the crimes were so vast and it was so big a number. This is concerning, of course, because that was a repeated theme. And also when the point about Eritrea was raised, the government responded that Eritrea was their friend. Half of the crime, like more than half of the crimes in Tigray were committed by Eritrean troops. So you have like a ridiculous number of victims who have not been accounted for whatsoever in this transitional policy system. And the government's response was that Eritrea was their friend and these crimes would be dealt with bilaterally with the government of Eritrea, who we know has been extremely I have no words to describe how the government of Eritrea has been throughout this process. But you have an entire population who are unaccounted for in this transitional justice system, and where there is no justice for these crimes, individuals will feel like there is no law and order generally, or there is no state or government that is there to protect them, or nothing is guaranteed. So for this reason, we're seeing an exodus of Tigrayans, and not just Tigrayans, Ethiopians generally just leaving the country because they can't depend on the state or the country itself to be stable for a prolonged period of time. So so just this week, at Europe Anina, we confirmed that there was a withdrawal of ENDF troops for whatever reason from the border region, which I don't know, we don't know what's going to happen, but people in that region are feeling like there's going to be conflict again and are moving to towns and things like that. So we have people who are walking on eggshells, who will have resentment down the line, and ultimately impunity has always led to violence and renewed violence. So I'll stop there, Vanessa.
Thank you very much, Rita. There's again, a lot of points have been raised around the current justice mechanisms that exist, what's possible, what should we be doing in the future, all very interesting topics that we will get to, I promise. But there is one question around the consequences of impunity that I still want to address, and it does connect to the current situation in the country, specifically around security issues in the Amhara region, in the Oromo region, and just human rights abuses overall in the country. I like to categorize consequences of injustice into three, and we've covered two. The final one is, what does a culture of impunity do to security officers, not to security personnel, but just to people in general? If you think you're going to get away with a crime, does that embolden you to continue committing crimes? Does that further violence in a country? And is it fair to say that the lack of justice and the cycle of impunity has created a country where it's free for all, kind of looking at the situation in across Ethiopia for the past, again, looking back decades. So if by referencing the current security situation in the country, could you make that claim? And if so, why is that not being taken into consideration by people working on Ethiopia, specifically states now? So I'll ask that question, and then anyone who wants to answer, please feel free to go ahead.
Sorry, let me come into that. So Ethiopia is a very good example of what you have just said. Impunity brings about cycle of violence because it emboldens all the actors, and they say they feel that there is no accountability, so they will take they will do whatever they want to do, because most of them, like if you look at the evolution of violence in Ethiopia, in the last 30 years, most of it was mainly by government forces, even if there were some inter-communal violences happening here and there. But as I've said, there was no accountability, and down the line, the amount of violence has increased, and now it has become atrocity, and atrocity like beyond imagination. Maybe we have not reached to the level of Srebrenica, but taken together, it is more than Srebrenica. All of the things that happened in the last years. So if someone is going to study Ethiopia, like how violence have been evolving, one thesis they can prove is that impunity, widespread impunity, brings about violence. But I mean, you don't need to be only limited to Ethiopia, but other situations in other countries are also the same. Like if you look at Myanmar, if you look at Libya, if you look at Syria, currently Sudan, all these crises huge level crises are results of culture of impunity, or at least one of the main factors is culture of impunity. And you can remember what happened in Darfur before 20 years and how similar are the kind of violations that's happening right now. So it doesn't require that much genius to know that impunity is the father of violence or the mother of violence. Or the parent of violence, actually, both. So it brings about all these things. In Ethiopia, I mean, if you look at, there is one question which I would really like to address in the chat. And the question is that, what would be the role of international investigation mechanisms in this situation? When there is no credible initiative for the government to address this gap, the international mechanisms are there not to give or not to ensure justice here right now, but they are very important in terms of documentation. Documentation is a form of satisfaction for the victims. I remember talking to a lot of victims who have been quite grateful because I spoke to them, just because I spoke to them. And the act of documentation is part of the relief, part of the redress for the victims. Maybe some of us were not in that position and we cannot imagine that kind of, but having that attention of taking your story, documenting this story is part of that relief for the victims. And in addition to that, in the absence of any credible domestic mechanism, the documentation and evidence preservation is going to be very important because the justice might not be possible now, but we have seen a number of situations where perpetrators were brought to justice, either by international mechanisms or by universal jurisdiction after 20 years. I remember one case in Sudan where one company was accused of human rights violations, and now a case is pending in Sweden against that company. We know what is happening in Belarus now, where one former DES squad member, special squad member, is brought to justice in Switzerland, and his trial has started after so many years. So these mechanisms, international mechanisms, have a very critical role of preserving and collecting evidence which can be used in the future. So this is also a very important role. So when there is no credible, trustworthy justice initiative, the international community has a role to play. But what's happening in Ethiopia is that the victims are being double victims by the international community, as we are likely to see right now, because they are just turning away from the situation in Ethiopia. They are not trying to look at the reality in the country. They are just capitalizing on the cessation of hostilities agreement and the cessation of hostilities in Tigray. But another situation, another potential armed conflict, international humanitarian law term, is starting and is already claiming lives in Amhara region. While we were talking about the violations in northern Ethiopia for the last 3 years, there was a simmering conflict in Oromia where hundreds of people were killed. And those situations are not resolved. In fact, they are becoming more and more serious. The Amhara situation has become an open conflict right now. And we have seen a lot of reports about allegations of mass killings, extrajudicial executions, and all those things. So, but the international community, because of their rush to stabilize their relationship with the government, and because of all these geopolitical shenanigans, they don't want to look at the reality. They want to look at their geopolitical interest, and they are victimizing the victims again by forgetting, by turning down the only mechanism which is trustworthy. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. I will hand over to the other panelists in a second. I just wanted to say we have 10 minutes left of the panel. I have been looking at comments and I've decided to incorporate them into my answers as opposed to having a separate Q&A session. And I think what I'll do is I'll leave that question open and then ask my final question, and then people can find ways of either answering all questions together, or you can choose to, of course, leave out anything that you don't want to discuss. My kind of jumping on that and jumping on the answer Fisaha gave, my question was around what happens now. So we have addressed, I think I really wanted to emphasize the dire consequences of impunity in Ethiopia. And I think we've been able to walk through many different examples. But now that we have understood that impunity needs to be a priority, what happens in Ethiopia now? Can we look at the domestic options that exist? And some of you have addressed them. If you have time or if you have the interest, would you mind describing that in a bit more depth? What is wrong with the, for example, the National Transitional Project or the initiative by the Ethiopian government? Why is that not going to work? What about the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission? Why is that not an option? Is there space to kind of discuss that more? And then if those are not credible options, then what about the regional and international mechanisms? There have been well-documented evidence of the Ethiopian government's campaign to stop any kind of foreign, whether that's regional from the African Commission or international investigations in Ethiopia. Can we speak more about those? Why are they trying to stop them? Could they be helpful? Fisaha already talked about some of the benefits of having some of these mandates, but would they be better than the domestic ones? And if so, why? And then finally, final question, and I guess this kind of seeps into that answer, is what is the way forward? So, if any of these if we find that these are the best options, then of course we have the answer, but is that enough? If we do get the domestic, we get the regional, we get the international, what else needs to be included? Some of the panelists did discuss this. There's a massive project that needs to happen if we are to save the country as we know it. Dr. Abadir gave a very haunting warning about the potential failure of a state. So what is needed to save the state? Is it just justice? Is it transitional justice? Or is it more? So I think that will be my final very big question. I'm very sorry, but feel free to take out and pick apart whatever you think. And just to add to the final question, when you look forward, is it enough to just look at the most immediate period, 5, 10, 20 years? Do we need to look back further to kind of address real grievances in the country? Some people speak about problems in Ethiopia starting in 1991. I've seen many comments in the chat as well around the problems, the divisions in Ethiopia started in 1991. But I think for a fact, we can say that that's not true. So how far back do we need to go to really address some of these burning questions that might lead, as Dr. Abadir warned, to a collapse? So I'll leave it there and feel free anyone to jump in, and then we'll end the panel in 10 minutes. So that gives everyone around 3 minutes each.
Did you call me out, or are you giving Rita or Fisaha?
You can, you're here, so go ahead. No,
okay, I'm already here. Okay, those are really difficult questions, and as you have as you have guessed and implied, my response is going to focus on the need for a political transition. That's really at the root of not just being able to have justice in Ethiopia, or even distributing food aid in Ethiopia. I don't know. I think I recently watched on the news that 20 million or something was the number of people in Ethiopia that are dependent or are dependent on food aid to survive. That's a huge jump from 5 years ago. And you can't really even talk about distributing food aid or political transition or justice without being able to achieve a political transition into anything that is more stable than we have right now. I'm not even going to talk about transition to democracy and in those ideal terms, because Ethiopia is a difficult situation and it needs to transition into something more stable that is more participatory than it is today, participatory in terms of political actors and political players, if possible, democratize, or at least start on the path of democratization. And if that doesn't happen, so when your question about domestic justice is going to depend on, if you don't have political transition, you're going to have, it's going to be nigh impossible to have transitional justice or any form of justice in Ethiopia. So the question is then what happens in the immediate term? In the immediate term, I think I will repeat what Fasaha said because it's important. Establish structures for investigation, documentation, and the preservation of evidence, because transitional justice is not going to happen in Ethiopia anytime soon. Therefore, you need to prepare for that prospect and not pretend that you're going to go to Ethiopia and have transitional justice and post it on Twitter. And so it's very very important to continue and maintain institutions such as ICRI, and those international institutions of investigation don't necessarily have to be UN-based. It would have been ideal if an institution like ICRI was continued. If not, you still need to have a safe space within which to document, to collect evidence, and so on. So you need to have that established as soon as possible. And international support for Ethiopia needs to be established and strengthened. UN, non-UN, governmental, non-governmental. And simultaneously, there needs to, a local process has to be started. A local process has to be started because the investigations have to be local. And ways of smoothly moving from international to local when the local context changes needs to be established now as well. What you have, for example, with the joint investigation that happened in the past, there were serious problems because of local resistance, political resistance. There was serious trouble with getting even evidence that has already been collected by UN actors, by United Nations and allied actors. So you need to, at this point, you need to have an international framework set up, simultaneously an Ethiopian framework that works together smoothly, moves from one to the other. Quickly on how far back it should go, I think it should go as far back as it needs to. There is a need for, there are different types of needs in Ethiopia when it comes to transitional justice. For example, before 2018, serious war crimes and crimes against humanity happened in Ogaden, and they happened in Gambella, and there are like small bits and pieces of places where war crimes or crimes against humanity type actions happened. But the overall need was for transitional justice was to investigate torture, and the torture, there was a government torture program back then. Currently, it may be disappearances. After the 2020 war, you have one of the darkest episodes in Ethiopian history that happened in the Tigray war. I can't think back in history. I think of one or two points in Ethiopian history where something that serious happened, but it might be beyond it might be beyond anything in Ethiopian history. So that is so there are so many different contexts within Ethiopia, and part of that has historical components. So what you can call historic justice needs to happen in Ethiopia as well, and how far back does it go is going to be dependent on Ethiopians themselves. You can't have one cookie cutter answer and say 2020 1990, because guess what? The Red Terror happened before that. Haile Selassie regime committed war crimes before that. Menelik, I mean, you can't really have a cutting point. Ethiopians need to, in conversation and discussion amongst each other, figure out how far back they are willing to go.
Thank you very much. Please, Fasaha and Rita, give your comments as well. I know we are closing soon. We're going to keep, I don't know if that's okay. I'll check in with our admin, but if we can, everyone can provide their answers. Feel free to go over a little bit over after the time limit. I did want to add, if it's possible, for either Dr. Abadir to come back on this or Fisaha and Rita, to just a very brief kind of, I don't know, critique is the right word, assessment of the current domestic initiatives. I think it's important. And I do think people understand roughly that, you know, we don't think justice is going to happen. But when you see the US embassy, when you see the German embassy posting, as you said on Twitter, saying, you know, we're so excited to work together with the Ethiopian government on justice initiatives in Ethiopia, it does raise the question to the public, oh, is justice maybe possible in Ethiopia? And you did already said, and several people said, it's, you know, it's possible, but it's not probable. Or it's possible, but it's, you know, it would just, you've written very well on this before, so it would be good to get some kind of insight onto why we don't think it's going to matter. Rita did mention, you know, for example, just to start off, Eritrea isn't even included, and to have one of the largest parties to the war not even included is obviously already a big problem, but there are obviously other problems as well. So I just wanted to say, Fisaha and Rita, go ahead, and then if you wanted to add anything, Dr. Abadir, at the end, feel free to do so. We're going to go over time a little bit. We still have a big group left with us, so if that's okay with all the panelists, I think we'll do that. Perfect. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Let me give the chance to Rita, and I'll come after her.
All right. Okay, thank you, Fisaha. I think I'll start off with another flaw. Like you said, Eritrean crimes are not included, and their crimes cannot be punished by this transitional justice mechanism that they've put together. Another flaw is the consultations that they've been saying that they've been having with victim groups, CSOs, academics and whatnot throughout the country. It's what they presented here at the side event, trying to lobby the delegates to be on their side. And what we saw in Tigray was the Ministry of Justice and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission went to Tigray, gathered CSOs, the Genocide Commission, academics from Maqale University and so on, and asked them what they thought about the Green Paper. Many of them had complaints. One, that it's not Pretoria based because it doesn't include both parties. It's not the TPLF and the government of Ethiopia putting this together. Two, that Eritrean troops are not included. Three, that a lot of the victims are not willing to give their testimonies or give their word to this transitional justice system. But a lot of the victims also see the government or this institution, the Ministry of Justice and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, as kind of a perpetrator that they are up against as well. And they gave them a lot of these complaints. Everyone across from the scholars to the CSOs were in alignment that this system was flawed and that it's not something that they could engage with. The Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the Ministry of Justice went back to, they said they'd take into consideration what everybody had said, they'd do some edits and come back and consult them with a second draft. What they did was they came back with a second draft. They excluded, I think, the Genocide Commission, but had the CSOs and whatnot still involved, and came back with OHCHR and presented the same thing, the exact same thing that they'd done. So it was clear that they'd just done this as a performance stunt to say they are consulting with all of these different groups across the country. If that was the case in Tigray, I assume that will have been the case throughout the country, because in alignment with what the commissioners said yesterday, the victim groups from across all of Ethiopia, so Amhara, Afar, the minority groups, Kunama, Irob, and so on, that were involved in this conflict, were all in alignment that they did not want to engage with this transitional justice policy. So what the Ethiopian government is saying, in that the groups across the country do want to engage with it, is just completely false. Domestic remedies are, of course, valid if they're credible. But it's just that at the moment they're not, for the reasons that I've already stated. What Fisaha said, and Abadir also said was really important in that it isn't just ICRI that can give us some form of justice going forward, and that we should have mechanisms that are truly independent and credible going forward. And we should also be assisting CSOs and organizations that are upholding human rights to do the work, to collect this evidence, to pursue justice going forward. What the Commission has found, and what was obvious to anyone who's been following Ethiopia, is that they are indeed enacting quasi-compliance, and they're doing the absolute bare minimum to look good in front of the international community and look workable with. They're not in any way at the moment committed to justice, and what they're doing is doubly victimizing the victims of these international crimes. By ending the ICRI mandate, what the member states, like you said, the Twitter posts and so on, are doing is telling the perpetrators that yes, it's fine, like you do what you did and you'll get away with it. And what they're telling the victims is it's fine, like it's whatever's going to happen to you is going to happen to you, and no one is there. Like there are no institutions that actually work. So what they're doing by ending the ICRI mandate is undermining the Human Rights Council itself. I think that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rita. And just to add, there was a clear shift in the approach to Ethiopia. And I do want to emphasize that there wasn't a perfect response. Like there wasn't a before and after in terms of the international community was incredible. There was a cessation of hostilities, and then now the international community has turned. The international community has in many ways failed the people who are impacted by the conflict in Ethiopia prior to the cessation of the conflict as well. But there is a shift where they have gone from, you can say, semi-failure to complete failure post the conflict, peace agreement that happened. And our latest report that documented violations that happened in the Tigray region after the conflict, the peace agreement in last year, there was a specific line that stood out to me that I wanted to share. And it's an Eritrean soldier telling a woman that is being held as a sexual slave, that you can scream all you want, whether you shout or not, no one's going to come and rescue you, and ended up raping that person for 3 months after. And I think that line in so many ways captures how the international community has responded and engaged on Ethiopia. They are screaming and they shut down, there wasn't any ways for people to communicate, and yet there were attempts by the diaspora, there were attempts by international organizations from the outside to voice these concerns, and they were ignored. And then after the conflict supposedly ended, this continued, and the soldiers were aware, and the people who, on all levels in terms of the hierarchy are aware that you can scream, you can shout, no one's going to come and rescue you, and no one's going to come and arrest us. So we will just keep doing what we're doing. And it's very sad to see that language from the room of the Human Rights Council, of how they ignored it being used on the ground way after the conflict supposedly ended, and way after some of these institutions that are, with pride speak about their foreign policy being feminist, or with pride speaking about their foreign policy being rooted in human rights, completely abandoning them. So just wanted to add that as well. And I'll give one of the final remarks from Fisaha, and then anyone who wants to add anything after Fisaha is very welcome to do so as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I just have one line, which is about the different ways they are treating the situation in Ethiopia from other situations, from other similar situations. We know how the Western world especially has responded to when the Ukraine war started and continued. We know the amount of investigation, the amount of resource that has been put into the investigation by different mechanisms and countries into that situation. When it comes to situations in Africa, especially Ethiopia, what happened is the reverse, actually. I don't really like usually to compare atrocities, but what happened and is happening in Ethiopia is as gross and as big in magnitude as what's happening in other parts of the world. That's the attention, the interest given to the situation is extremely dismal. The situation in Ethiopia has never been discussed in the UN Security Council. It has never been an agenda. It was always an AOP, any other business. And now the situation has not stopped. It just metastasized into another conflict in other parts of the country. And there is no action. Actually, they are leaning towards closing down the only investigative mechanism. While they are strengthening, while they are discussing different tribunals for the situation in Ukraine. I'm not saying that the situation in Ukraine does not deserve that, but the situation in Ethiopia deserves equal attention. Victims in Africa are the same victims as those who are in Europe. So the violation, the suffering is the same. So the only difference is the proximity to those who are in power, and also maybe their empathy to the victims. They have different levels of empathy to the victims. So that's one thing which I would like to underscore. There is double standard which is permeating the global order, especially the human rights order currently, and those in Ethiopia are being victims of that. The other thing is that, like, I want to underscore that domestic justice is the best justice when possible. It's not that we want to replace domestic justice, which is feasible. The only thing is that the one in Ethiopia is not feasible, and we have a lot of evidence for that. I can give you a lot of evidence. For instance, if you look at the Ethiopian laws, are they capable of investigating and charging someone for crimes against humanity? No. Rape is a crime in Ethiopia, but not as a crime against humanity. The crime against humanity provision does not exist in the Ethiopian criminal law. If you look at the procedure, if any violation is committed by members of the security force or other forces who are aligned to them, they will be tried by the military court. And the military court is not independent because they are appointed by the prime minister and the chief of the army. And I can give you other examples. There is lack of culture of impunity and culture of like not prosecuting those who are in power. And there is no trust. So for the domestic mechanism, including the transitional justice mechanism, to be effective and to gain the confidence, it has to reinvent itself. Because those who have been enablers of the violence, atrocity in the last few years cannot be the judges themselves. So they need to bring in more civil society, more victims. And we know, like, for instance, the civil society in Ethiopia has been part of the violence. Some of the feminist groups have been justified or apologists for the rape in the context of war. So these people, can they be trusted to be part of the transitional justice? No. So the domestic mechanism, it has to be reinvented. But until that happens, the international mechanism, the regional mechanism are going to be indispensable. Thank you.
I'll add two more sentences, Vanessa, if I may. I will say, despite agreeing with what you said, I think it's also important to remember that the sanctions, the international pressure was very important in ending the impunity in Ethiopia, not ending the impunity, but ending the most serious war crimes in the north of Ethiopia. And they are going to be important in the future as well, and what's going on in the Amhara region and what's going in the Oromia region. And the reason soldiers were committing atrocities and telling their victims the United Nations is not going to save you, or the US or the international community is not going to save you, is because they know the amount of pressure that was coming from the international community. And, to add to what Fasaha said, when you see those same authors of the violence and their enablers, the hashtag Hands Off Ethiopia or hashtag No More campaign, the authors of those, the resistance against international pressure and giving Ethiopia, the Ethiopian regime and or perpetrators, the enabling space within which they commit violence. Those groups, when you see those groups and the perpetrators come together with those who impose the sanctions and take selfies together, what you see is that the conclusion that comes out of it is that Ethiopia's quasi-compliance campaign, Ethiopia's impunity campaign, must have succeeded. Because that is the inescapable conclusion. And how quasi-compliance works is not just that Ethiopia is maneuvering within that space, but Ethiopia is also creating the possibility for the international community to say, oh, look, they're doing something. Therefore, we're moving on. And that is not going to help the cause of justice. And that's not even going to help the cause of peace. And I just want to reemphasize that there needs to be a strong stance and unity in the international community to prevent atrocities, but also to push the different actors in Ethiopia to sit at the table and achieve a transition to a more stable form of governance.
Excellent. Thank you very much to all the panelists, to Dr. Abadir, to Rita, to Fasaha, for your presentations, for your answers to my long and many questions. I'm sure that this conversation could go on forever, but we'll end it now because we've been on for almost 2 hours. And hopefully we can continue the conversation on social media. If people have any questions or thoughts, feel free to share it. We have been using the hashtag #RenewICRI to have conversations around why ICRI should be renewed, what the importance of ICRI is. So if you are interested in continuing the conversation, feel free to do that using the hashtag, and maybe some of us can jump in if we can. Thank you again to everyone and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa.